primarily as an intelligence gathering activity. If you change the present based on foreknowledge of it, then the problem is you diminish the quality of your database derived from quantum access. So you have to decide, are you going to model future events, send people there, generate holographic images of them and so forth, to know what's going to occur there and prepare for it, or are you going to constantly sample the future, change it, and then diminish the quality or what you know about the events that come after the changed event? So I think that it's clear that they decided to do the former. They thought, well, the greatest use of this technology will be allow us to prepare for the future. We'll make the philosophical and religious decision not to play God and alter the future, and in so doing, we'll preserve the optimum quality of our intelligence database about future events. The other model would have been to constantly sample the future, send people there, or alter conditions in the present to divert future events. But then once they actively began changing the course of human destiny doing that, they then had to endeavor with even more passion, more intent and focus to try to speed up and figure out what happened after that changed event in the future. So I'm confident that they chose to simply look into the future. If they sent somebody there, send them on the basis of the prime directive. Don't try to change anything. Be very hold back. Don't bring anything back from the future unless it's intelligence that's been prepared for us on the project. If we modeled a future event with the holograms produced by the chronovisors, we won't then, we'll just derive intelligence. We won't derive operational planning based on foreknowledge of future events. And there's also an inherent conundrum of the interpolation of a changed future. If you do determine that you're going to try to change it once you know what you see, you kind of get into a chicken and the egg phenomenon of circular causation. So I think that because of the complexities of that, they thought, we'll just use this to try to make everybody as safe as possible and not play God. And that's what I think they've done.
There's also a moral... Wait, I got a question. There's also a moral dilemma here. If the presidents had prior knowledge of their presidency through intelligence given to them, then there could be a preparatory program put into place to sort of guide who the intelligence aid could guide future presidents in fulfilling that role as president. I mean, through giving them information, knowledge, education, insight.
Yes, there indeed is a moral dimension, and let me clarify here. Between just observing the future and gathering intelligence about it, and actively trying to change the future based on prior knowledge of it, I think the best expression of what I believe they have done as standing policy is actually in some cases operate on the margin between those two approaches. Because to be sure, that the information I encountered in childhood and later indicated that they're not just identifying future U.S. presidents, but they're apprising them of their destinies. I don't know if they're training them. And I don't know if, for example, they're giving them staff people to get them elected. In other words, if they can identify a Barack Obama as they did. When I met President Obama, we were 20 years old. Well, it was clear from that encounter that he and even some of his friends in the anti-apartheid movement knew that he was going to be president. Now, that's knowledge. I don't know if they then trained him or guided him to his position.
Would you mind telling that story?
Sure, and I think that expresses what... And also, of course, there's their prior notification to me about my Mars findings. I think they've been operating on the margin of quantum interpolation of future events, future information in the lives of the participants. We know that's been going on. Now, whether they're then trying to bring future events about as a result of knowing who's going to be involved in those events, that's data that I don't have. That's maybe the data that Dan Rather was going to be collecting about President George W. Bush when he went in search of what President Bush was doing in 1973 and lost his anchor chair at the CBS News as a result. But I met President Barack Obama in the spring or summer of 1982 when I was an undergraduate at the University of California at Los Angeles. I had been having a conversation of a political nature with an anti-apartheid activist from South Africa who had a card table out and was pamphleteering on Bruin Walk, which is a walkway on the UCLA campus where people basically pamphleteer regarding different political issues. They distribute their literature and so forth. And I was talking to this South African named John. He had blonde, curly hair, I remember, and about a variety of issues. He was lobbying for divestment by the University of California from South Africa as a way of fighting apartheid in South Africa. And I was sharing with him some of the views about different issues in law and policy regarding the transnational corporations that had been shared with me when I interviewed the futurist Buckminster Fuller back in October of 1981. And I was just describing some of the things Fuller had discussed during actually it was a 6-hour interview over 2 days, and I became engrossed in Fuller's thinking because I had the opportunity to interview him and just be inspired by such a brilliant individual. And so I was sort of obsessed about Bucky's thinking there for a year or so. And I said, yeah, Fuller's stating that the CIA is raising an entirely mercenary army in Pakistan. And the South African said, really? Well, that's an unusual comment. Well, listen, you've got to come with me to my house I'm renting in West Los Angeles and meet my guest, because he was just in Pakistan. And I'm sure he'd be fascinated with what Fuller told you about Pakistan and some of Fuller's ideas about the direction that the transnational corporations are headed in. And these were just the standard issues regarding the environment and labor and, wages and social conditions that later became expressed, let's say, in a book like When Corporations Rule the World by David Korten. I mean, this was the early 1980s, and people were really starting to think about, what kind of impact are these non-political organizations called corporations going to have on political economy and world order? And so we drove in his VW Bug from Lot 6 there on the UCLA campus over to the area near San Vicente Boulevard and Bundy, for your listeners who are familiar with West Los Angeles. And we went into the home that he was renting, and I stood in the kitchen, and his house guest walked out from one of the bedrooms and introduced himself. And he said that his name was Barack Obama. And I know that it was President Obama because I actually questioned him about his rather unusual name. I have an unusual surname, and so I commented about his unusual name, and he discussed the fact that his father was from Kenya and that he was Barack Obama Jr. and so forth. Now, we then had about a half-hour discussion about some of Fuller's ideas. Barack Obama asked me about what Fuller had said about Pakistan, and he said, I don't know why Fuller said that, because I don't think that's happening. He described his recent trip there. Now, of course, that trip was undertaken at a time when there was a ban, and it was illegal for U.S. citizens to visit Pakistan. So we think that President Obama may have visited Pakistan on his Indonesian passport, which he may have retained from childhood or even updated in adolescence. But nonetheless, he described how he'd just been to Pakistan. And then we returned to this issue of the corporations that I've been discussing with his friend from South Africa. And our conversation became kind of heated. I was taking more of a socialist position on the corporations that a Bucky Fuller or a Scott Nearing or a David Korten might espouse. And Barack Obama, who ended up becoming president, was pursuing a much more doctrinaire, sort of Harvard Law School kind of defense of the transnational corporations, how they were necessary to involve people in joint enterprises and this kind of thing. And as our conversation began to unravel into something of an argument, his friend intervened and said, listen, Andy, you better be nice to him because he's going to be president of the United States someday. And at that time, I wasn't thinking about my experiences as a child in Project Pegasus and the fact that the U.S. government had achieved a time travel capability that gave them knowledge of future events, including who would become president. And I said something flippant like, oh, well, maybe we'll pitch against each other during the same game of this, the seventh game of the same World Series or something like that. And then Barack Obama smiled and began walking up the stairwell inside the house, the internal stairwell, and then I turned to his friend, and his friend grabbed sort of my shirt and said, no, and came closer to me and said, "No, you don't understand, Andy." And he pointed up to Barack Obama as he was walking up the steps and said emphatically, "We know he's going to be president of the United States." And when he said that, Barack Obama looked down at us and shook his head sort of affirmatively, sort of confident, like, you betcha I'm going to be president of the United States. Now, that was the second of three future presidents that I met personally, two of whom showed prior knowledge of their presidencies. The other was an encounter that my father and I had.
Andy?
Yeah.
We've got a caller if you're willing to take one.
Certainly, right.
Okay, we've got Brett from CA, from California on line B2.
Hello, Andy.
Brett?
Yes.
How are you doing?
Good, Brett.
Do you have a question for Andy?
So far, the show is going great. I didn't mean to interrupt it.
It's okay. It's okay.
Wow, I was just thinking back about the bismuth and everything, and the travel and the traveling and stuff.
Right. This is Brett Stillings. Brett, let me just explain your involvement in the story. Brett Stillings is an individual who I met in the summer of 1980 when my father and I were camping near Mount Shasta in Northern California. And Brett is the son of a Lockheed engineer who our fathers intentionally introduced us, we believe, because we were both known to be in the future time travel timeline. So, Brett, why don't you tell the listeners why you think my recitation of bismuth is significant, and also what your father said to you on that trip up to Shasta from your home in Southern California.
All right. Well, for one, I believe that there's a talk about bismuth being octaves above bismuth, and when you get into octaves, I believe there's 9 octaves, and as you increase the energy level and the proton energy level, bismuth has 7 energy levels. You have 2, 6, 12, 8, 22, 32, 1. And as you add 32, you push another proton into the next higher energy level of the 8th, into the 8th energy level, which is Bob Lazar's element 115. And you do so again, adding 32, and you arrive at 147. And but what gravity tends to do, or what they're learning, mainstream science hasn't really admitted that gravity propagates as a wave, and certainly hasn't admitted that it propagates instantly. But gravity tends to hang around the electron shell of the atom, or tends to propagate towards. And as it does, it bends and goes elsewhere. That's where the lensing effect comes into play. So one of the thinking, or along the lines of the thinking, is that that a gravity wave is also used to propagate the field, and to be able to see past and future events. One of the other things is that as you arrive at higher elements, they also take on interesting properties. They also become, as you get on the octaves, they also geometrically stable. That they're bismuth actually technically shouldn't look the way it does, and technically from from my own personal feelings or experiences, that it technically should be a liquid, but it's not. It's what it is, and it has very peculiar properties, or high diamagnetic strength, and so on.
Yeah, Scott and Tom, if I might just, I don't want to take over the host role here, but Brett
Go ahead.
Contacted me about a year ago after he heard me on radio